We're live.
Hello,
Hello, and welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I am Brandon Tessers.
and I am Caitlin Miller.
It always feels so contrived to me to like make that pause for you to introduce yourself, but like
I
there's
know it
nothing bad
does
about
every time.
it is a little contrived, but it's not bad to be contrived. How else would
Yeah,
we
it's
do it?
also there's like the flip side of it is it's ritualistic, which can be calming and grounding.
Sure. And also just how would we make room for each of us to introduce ourselves without like having some structure to it? Anyway,
Yeah.
this is the This Is Not Therapy Hour. It is not therapy for very, very many reasons,
No.
even though Caitlin and I are both licensed therapists. It
hmm
is an open
For
conversation.
now. Yeah.
Oh, interesting. I have no intention of that changing, but
Yeah.
for now is like one of those statements that's always true, but ominous when you say it. You know,
Yeah.
like, oh, the
Always.
weather's very pleasant for now.
I'm gonna switch it to for always.
That that might not be true. I mean, theoretically, at some point, I will die and will no longer then be a licensed therapist.
Oh,
Uh,
that's true.
a lot to do with language and English in particular, actually, but got to do our whole intro thing before
Oh
getting
yes, the
into
whole intro. Hi, Brandon. What's the rest of the
it.
intro?
This is not therapy, it's an open conversation. Caitlin and I are here and available to you all. We are going to be talking with one another and with you all. And who you all are, we don't know. So you're just in our imagination. We're doing our best to think of who you might be and what you might be interested in and how you might interpret things. If you participate by putting things into the chat, then we will have more information about who you are. We'll see the things that you're saying, and that will impact what we do. In the same way that every conversation where two people or more are paying attention to one another, they are impacted by one another. So we'll talk about whatever we're talking about. And for those of you watching, jump in the chat as soon and as frequently and as much as you would like. Don't worry about whether what you're saying is on or off the topic of what we're already talking about.
hmm I would
Um,
love to hear from you.
yeah, Caitlin and I both work with a therapy practice called Effective Artistry with offices in Northbrook, Illinois. We do individual, couples, and family therapy with people in
hmm
the state of Illinois. We also work with a couple executive functioning coaches who work with people all over the world. Um, yeah, I think that's good.
Yeah, that's great.
All right. Good to see you, Caitlin. How are you?
Good. I am vibing off of the 1970s wood paneling.
Oh, I bet it's even older than that. Yeah. I'm
Yeah,
at I'm at a
yeah.
lake house. I know the 1970s is when like people in the suburbs started using it, but I feel like
hmm
when I've been at lake houses and I've been fortunate enough in my life to be at, well, I don't know about many different, but I've been at lake houses many different times. It does seem like people like wood in all their decor all the time. It's
Yeah. And I'm from Wisconsin, so I I think I get the
like
vibe.
80% lake houses, right?
Oh no, not 80%, but lots of wood.
I am not from the Midwest, and lake houses are like a very Midwestern cultural concept, which makes sense in its
Interesting.
roots, whatever. Hmm?
I didn't know that.
Well, it's not that people outside of the Midwest don't have lake houses; those things exist. But the idea of like the lake house is it is a thing that's much more prevalent in the Midwest than in other regions, partly just in large part, actually, I think a lot of it is geography, economic history, and whatever. Um,
Interesting.
but like, yeah, that concept of like the lake house or the family lake house, the number of people that I meet that their family has a lake house in the Midwest is a high number, where in Utah is not very many.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Hmm. What is on my mind? Pottery. Pottery is on my mind.
yeah, what about?
Yeah. Um, rigging up pottery lights. So I've been making some lamps and I don't like to plan for dimensions. I'm not really into the whole planning thing. So when they come out, I'm like, okay, can a salt lamp bulb fit? Is it a real bulb? What can the base of the bulb be? How can I figure this all out on Amazon? And how, most importantly, can I not ask for help and do it all myself? So there's a like mushroomy lamp that came out yesterday from the kiln, and I realized that none of the bulbs I have will work for it, but I did have an idea, and I learned about a new type of bulb, and then I purchased one. So that's what I'm
Why
thinking about, is bulbs.
why do you not like planning what light bulb you're going to put in it?
Oh, I do have ideal light bulbs to put in it, but different pottery, different clay bodies shrink at different rates, and so I would have to be really precise and learn the shrinkage rate for each clay I use to then be able to ensure that the type of bulb will fit into it. And that is
It's not
something
that you
that,
have a preference for doing it this way, it's just that the cost of learning to do it the other way is higher than it's worth to you.
correct.
Okay. The
But
way
it
you
would be
phrased it
ideal
before,
because some of the lamps have different vibes, and I would like to be able to have it be the vibe I would like.
couldn't you just overshoot though? Like if it's an issue of shrinkage, couldn't you just make it big enough that you're confident that even at the like maximum shrinkage, it will still fit the bulb you want?
I did that a couple times, but without getting into the studio politics, I was big pieces are something that I'm trying to do less frequently. So now my goal is more of like, what is the smallest size my goal could come into fruition? And that, but yeah, my default would be just like make everything huge and then you have like every bulb option because then you can choose it all.
Oh, well, I didn't mean that. I meant like if you know what bulb you wanted, just make it big enough that you're confident that that bulb would fit in it instead of,
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I was like kind of confident. And then the other thing is the bigger you make something, more or less the better you have to be at making pottery. And so like the thing that I made is essentially a sphere on top of a cylinder, but then I cut a bunch of holes in both. So to make it strong enough to bind it together enough to have it get through both firings without cracks, like all of that stuff. So this was almost kind of like a prototype, but I would love to make bigger ones. So that's another aspect of
I
it
mean, I
too,
have
the
all kinds
thickness
of
and
questions and we could talk about
I
this for an
honestly, at
hour.
this point, am obsessed with ceramics and I would love to talk about it.
I don't
But
know much
also,
about
I
ceramics.
want
I
to
mean,
hear
look,
from you too, Brandon.
sure. Well, we have a comment. I don't know if you can see him on your
I can't see them,
setup, but
unfortunately.
is Fast
Yeah.
Insider. Hello, says this guy at my farmer's market makes these fun steampunk lamps, and I really wish I had the money and space for one of them. But
Ooh, are they steampunk like metal, like mixed media sculpture steampunk, or is it more of like ceramics? I'm guessing it's metal.
steampunk usually involves metal, but
Hmm. It's interesting. I just went back to my hometown recently and I met
they're
this
made out of
dude who,
pipes.
is that what they said? Pipes?
Yeah,
Okay,
sorry to
cool.
interrupt you.
Yeah, I met this dude who goes to like essentially junkyards and finds like diamonds in the rough and then fixes them up and then makes it into like beautiful pieces of furniture. I was like amazed, but it had kind of a steampunk vibe. He was like, "Yeah, I found this at a random farm." And I was like, "This is incredible."
It's cool. Steampunk, I think, is a very cool aesthetic, but it's also one that I don't think like mixes with other aesthetics very well. Like steampunk really stands out to me. So if you
Hmm.
have like if the rest of your decor is something else and then you have this one steampunk piece, it looks out of place.
Yeah, I feel like if everything else was making a huge statement, even if it was out of place, it would be like a part of essentially a very bold picture, but I think any sort of like minimalist, modern, or like typical Midwestern style home with just like one steampunk element would be that way.
But you're saying you would design it so that there's a ton of different pieces, each of which is very bold and stands out from each of the rest? That doesn't just sound chaotic and overwhelming to you?
No, it sounds amazing. It sounds like
I
a visual wonderland.
have to say, I'm a little offended that you would just presume that I'm talking about a minimalist or traditional, like Midwestern suburban style. I, you have seen my office. You've spent time in my office. I have my own aesthetics.
I honestly think a steampunk piece with like the gold accent decor with maybe a couple like 1960s elements would look great in your office and would technically be different from the vibe.
Yeah, me steampunk, similar to like goth aesthetic and some of these other ones, like they're very evocative of a very particular like setting, right? Like some of the shorthands you're using where you're talking about things as being like 1960s or Midwestern or whatever, where that's not the labels that would be used to describe the aesthetic, but it does map like when those aesthetics were popular or whatever.
Oh, yes, 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 yes.
Um, but some aesthetics like steampunk or like, if I were to walk around wearing like a gold crown or whatever, like some aesthetics are very linked in people's minds to a very specific setting, time and place, where like taking it
Oh,
out of that, I think can be jarring. And I think that's part of it with steampunk. Steampunk looks so cool when it's all steampunk. But when you see like, if I were to dress in whatever kind of a way, but wear like, steampunk like welder goggles or whatever, people be like, why are you wearing one part of a steampunk costume? Not like, oh, that's a piece you can mix and match or whatever.
mm-hmm.
You like seeing someone wear a business suit and like paint their lips black, like there's that one goth thing and then the rest of it isn't. Like that's an all or nothing kind of aesthetic for me.
Yeah, I guess part of how I conceptualize fashion and aesthetic is to do things that are jarring on purpose.
Then you wonder why people pay attention to you. We've had
That's
this
only when I'm
conversation
like
before.
trying to dress up or like in a home. That's interesting. Yeah.
But jarring is like, to me, there's two different kind of ways to talk about something being jarring. One is when we're talking about the kind of thing where you're attempting to like cause others to become uncomfortable, right? Like to do something, like I think of especially early, but still true of many types of heavy metal, where like a lot of the aesthetic is specifically designed around we're trying to offend and make certain people uncomfortable, more so than like
Mm-hmm.
we love this thing by itself. We love the impact it has on other people.
Mm-hmm.
Then it evolves into like we love this thing, which that's fine. But then the other kind of jarring is like even for you yourself who designed it, it's like oh, like hard to settle in and feel cohesion. Like you feel like you're in a different place every time you move your head, and that to me feels like something that I would love to have at like a museum or whatever, but that I wouldn't want to have in my home, where I would want things to be able to kind of like blend and then not call my attention to them anymore. I don't want to walk into my
Mm-hmm.
home every day and like have my attention called to the pieces every time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But anyway, it's not about a right and wrong thing. We just have different. You know how I feel about maximalism. It's overwhelming, sensorily overwhelming to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting about pulling the attention. I've found that particularly in my home, I can get so much into the cognitive environment that sometimes having jarring, like physical reminders, either like I find it jarringly beautiful that it pulls my attention. I guess that's not quite jarringly. Okay, I'm just going to use other language. It pulls my attention in ways because I find it so incredibly beautiful or so like bold or so much of a statement or like all of them together that it's like, oh yeah, I have a body and I live in a home and I have a dog and like maybe I should go for a walk, or maybe I should call a friend. Like,
I
so I don't know.
I agree that this is a relatively recent experience for me. So it just have now lived in the house in which I currently live for longer than I have ever lived in one place in my life.
Hmm.
Uh, the previous record was 5 years. So what happens to a person when they live in the same environment for longer than 5 years is not something I've experienced before.
Mhm.
And I think there is something to what you're saying where like we at first, of course, are wanting to design things where we live to be like comfortable and unintrusive, to like support us in what we're doing, but not call our attention and need us to do things. We don't want like a lot of things that take a lot of maintenance, and you know, you want to be able to not have to be like, I gotta walk carefully through this place every time you walk through your front door.
Yeah.
But there is a balance where like eventually, at least to me, eventually you start to learn a physical environment so well that nothing is calling your attention to the physical environment
Mhm.
anymore. And there are times where you want that to happen for sure. And I think there are
Mhm.
besides decor. Well, but I agree with you that like it's good to
Mhm.
have things that pull you out of your head without you having to make a deliberate decision to get pulled out of your head.
Mhm. Yeah, and this is not true of my current apartment, but in previous places I've lived, I've had series of like either bad memories or negative experiences, and I've found that sometimes redecorating is like it almost like my the cues feel as though it's almost a different space, and then sometimes it can be like, okay, this isn't the same thing I stared at when X, Y, or Z happened. Like I don't know.
Well,
So,
makes sense. I The language you're using obviously is like, or maybe not obviously. To me, the language you're using seems based in like trauma work kind of language, right? That
yeah,
you want it
often, yeah.
to not remind you of something traumatic that has happened in the past, which it makes sense to me. Um, what I would say is that, like Pocahontas says, you can't step in the same river twice. I'm sure she's not the one who first said that, but that's the lyric I know from that movie. That's where I know it from. Like the environment is different every single moment,
Hmm.
but having bigger differences and bigger changes is an even bigger difference. And yeah, like the more different something is, the more it calls your attention. The more things
Hmm.
stay the same, the more your attentional processes send that resources elsewhere. It's like important or necessary. I also like changing things up. I think there's a reason that there are many things that we associate with manic or hypomanic episodes that I think are very unfortunate that we associate it that way, because the thing itself is not inherently problematic. But now so many people, when they do or experience that thing, connect it to, oh no, does this mean I'm manic or hypomanic? And it turns fine
Hmm.
things into like scary things. And rearranging your environment is one of those things. That like,
Hmm.
you know, it's one of the things that will be looked at as a sign of someone being in a manic or hypomanic state is
Hmm.
going to great lengths about rearranging their home and cleaning things and changing things a lot.
Hmm.
I think there's just like you're talking about, and there's other ways we could describe it and other benefits too. There's just inherent reasons why sometimes we want to change things up, and then most of the time we don't, right? Like
Hmm.
when I want to rearrange things, I'm like walking around my house being like, what if we move this over here or change the purpose of this room entirely, whatever. It's not
Hmm.
typically a thing where it's like everything is the same, but now I'm going to think about moving this one thing. It's like long stretches of not thinking about changing things around.
Hmm.
And then when I get into that mode of wanting to change things around, it's like, okay, I got to look at everything.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, there was this YouTuber I once watched a video. I think she has a podcast too, and it's something about neurodiversity affirming interior design. And um, the thing I thought of, which I don't know if this is consciously connected to anything that she said because I cannot remember the specifics of what she said, but to sort of live in a space and then see what parts of it help you and what parts of it maybe like distract you or influence you in ways that make it harder for you to do the things you want to do, and then to try to challenge like conventional norms around the way spaces should be, and then to try to make it the way that works best for like your mind and what you're trying to accomplish in the space. And I feel like you're rolling your eyes. What are you thinking,
I
Brandon
think
Tesser?
that's cool. I want to call out Sebastian Siders made a couple comments that I haven't
Oh,
read,
cool.
and that it was
Yeah.
copper pipes, and they've thought of ways to like make it blend in more and it'd be good in a hipster industrial coffee shop. And then the more recent one is I feel like my brain wants me to be a minimalist, my hobbies want me to be a maximalist, and my aesthetics want me to have something in between, which I think is
I
related
would
to
love for
what
that to be a meme.
sure, a good one.
That
But
might go viral.
it strikes me as being related to what you're talking about, neurodiversity affirming interior design.
Mhm.
No, I wasn't rolling my eyes. I did laugh, chuckle slightly. I exhaled strongly out of my nose at the
Oh,
point
interesting, Brandon Tesser.
where you were saying they talked about like challenging conventional ideas about what a space should be. And it's not that I don't think that that's a good thing to suggest or for people to do.
Hmm.
Something I think, right, control is a binary concept. You either control something or you don't control it. Something is in your control or out of your control, right? And like all binary concepts, it's useful in certain ways, but it's not an accurate reflection of reality. So
Hmm.
I tend to talk more about influence, impact,
Hmm.
right? That you have more influence over some things, less influence over other things. Some things, the only influence you have is over the way you interact with it or are exposed to it or respond to it, whatever. And even that is small. So coming at it from that lens, one of the things that I think about, I was thinking from the lens of a therapist, but just generally as a person, you can assume, I think it is safe to assume that the more influence a person has over an environment, which also includes like the longer that they've been in that environment and have had influence over it, then we can kind of assume that the things that we see in the environment are a reflection of what works best for them and kind of reverse engineer from there, if that makes sense.
Really?
Which doesn't mean that nobody ever makes decisions about what they put in their home based on their concepts of what other people would think. In fact, I would say that almost every decision that every person makes about what's in their home is impacted at least somewhat by their ideas of what other people would think of those things.
Hmm.
It's not that I disagree with that statement. It's just, to me, that's one of those things that's like put in a very simple way that evokes a certain kind of righteous anger almost. Like, screw how everybody's been telling me what my space should be. I'm going to, like,
Hmm. Hmm.
that makes sense. Like it talks about making your space and all of a sudden brings in this element of like opposition and conflict as though you making your space what you want it to be is in some way opposed to what other people want your space to be, which isn't untrue. It's just sometimes I feel like we're forcing conflict in where it is not necessary or helpful.
Hmm.
Simply put, like this statement, and I'm not saying this person said that or that they think, I'm just responding to the way you phrased it to me. That
Yeah.
if we were to say like, let's make this space the way you want to make it, is a complete statement. So that additional next thing of regardless of what other people think a space should be is unnecessary. And so the only thing it brings into the communication is bringing into our awareness this concept of other people who would want your space to be different than it is, which is also connected to this implication that part of the reason that your space is the way that it is because of other people wanting it to be that way, and that your space is in ways like less comfortable or less helpful to you than it could be because these people have forced you to do it that way.
Do you think it could be more useful to say something like, let's try to design your space the way you want it to be, not the way you think it should be? So then it's less about oppositional to some sort of other
It would that would be less oppositional to other people, although it still would have that implication to me of like why would you
Hmm.
think it should be that way? But it's
Hmm.
at best it's still oppositional to you yourself, as opposed to the way you think it should be. Like, why do we need
Hmm.
to separate out what you want it to be from what you think it should be? What you think a space should be is part and parcel of what you want it to be.
Yeah, I'm thinking of clients who might like I've worked with someone previously who designed their kitchen around every surface trying to be as like clear and clean as possible, and then they would never cook, and then they started to think, okay, I want to cook more. How can I design the kitchen around cooking more versus around it like looking like what I would say a good kitchen should look like? And then it was like way more stuff is on the counter, and it's not like dirty, but it's just there's a lot more in immediate sight. And then they've engaged with cooking more. So I guess I was thinking about that and how sort of a reverse engineering of that would be, what about your space? It's something that you feel
I
like it should be.
have some thoughts on that, but Bast Insider said my roommate is very concerned about what her family and friends tell her an adult apartment should look like. It can be a little frustrating. I just want to say, but they don't live here. You and I do. And then, oh, the amount I cook is directly proportional to how clean and organized the kitchen is. That takes me back to what you were saying and my thoughts there. But
Hmm.
I would say I'm not trying to say that it is not true that other people will tell you what they think your space should be. That definitely happens. And we definitely, in fact, I would say universally and non-optionally take into consideration what other people, especially people we respect and care about, think about what our space should be. I'm saying you can't opt out of that. And it is true that it might influence you disproportionately, right? Like more so than what I think whatever this person is doing is very useful, but the utility of what they're doing is in saying, here are some things that I'm going to propose to you that you may have not considered before. And one of the mechanisms by which that happens, where like I could maybe propose something to you that you would, when you hear it, realize, oh, that would be helpful for me, but you haven't considered it yet, is because nobody else around you in your life has proposed that idea to you. They,
Oh.
so it is true that like the way it's designed is based in large part on what people have suggested to you that should be there. But we can
Hmm.
talk about, I can suggest new and different options to you that might be helpful to you without having to make it into an oppositional, like other people are trying to control your space. Because
Yeah.
that just brings in conflict where it isn't helpful or necessary,
Hmm.
including like putting people in a position where they then get mad at themselves for having allowed themselves to be influenced or controlled by other people for so long.
Hmm.
When it's just like that's the process. That's how yes, we come up with ideas on our own, but the majority of the ideas we have are handed to us by others, and even the ones we come up with on our own are built by combining things that other people have exposed us to.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I think I understand what you're saying, and I feel like that would be a way to frame the conversation that might, I guess if I'm putting myself in the shoes of the person talking to you, it would be easier for me to focus, I think, because I would get less feelings of opposition or defensiveness or even like judgment of myself. I don't know.
There are these, and and I know that I am like much more tuned in to paying much more attention to language and all the possible like implications that I can determine than people typically do. So when I'm pointing these things out, I am trying to do what I was just saying. I'm trying to say, here, I'm calling some things to your attention that you might want to consider that I think maybe you haven't considered. Not saying that what you've done is wrong and you should do it the way I'm saying it, right? So I don't want to come across like I'm criticizing this person because
Oh,
I think what they're doing
I'm
is
not
very
taking it
cool.
that way. Yeah.
But one of the like unthought implications that I know I am confident this person would not say that this is their thinking and that they're trying to get this across and that they would likely disagree with me that that there's any possibility that someone could even get this idea. But to
Hmm.
me, it reinforces the deficit model just the slightest little bit. Meaning like
Mhm.
if you and I were out shopping and you tried on some outfit and said, "What do you
Mhm.
think?" And my response was, "I think it's great, and I think you should do what you like, no matter what other people think it should be."
Ah!
Like, right, that implies to you that what I'm
I feel
saying
like
is
Brandon thinks a part of this outfit is ugly, but he's not willing to tell me.
right, or that I think it's great, but I think other people will not like it, but F the
Mhm.
haters, forget them kind of thing. It's it's unnecessary.
Mhm.
It calls attention to something that doesn't need to have attention called to it and isn't likely to be helpful. And it does reinforce this subtle thing of like, well, it's okay for you to do it this way because you're different from them. Don't listen to what works best for them.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I don't think that's a message that needs to be reinforced. I understand that
Yeah.
people believe that. It is something that we talk about a lot, and
Mhm.
people are looking for permission to be able to do the things that they want. But we can give people permission to do things the way that they want without having to connect it to, and it sucks that you haven't been doing it this way until now.
Yeah, that reminds me of and obviously this isn't the only way this phrase is used, and I think it can be useful, but like um are you, for example, are you making yourself work an extra 30 minutes every day because of the brainwashing of late stage capitalism? And I feel like sometimes people can be like, ooh, that's like provocative, and no, I'm going to cut out those 30 minutes. But then I think sometimes the implication of it can be like, oh, have I been brainwashed by late stage capitalism? And it took until now for either like my friend or my therapist to show me that I'm just brainwashed in a whole other way. And then that's like the deficit, like, oh, maybe I'm stupid, or maybe I could have tried harder to realize this, or oh, how could I, you know? So I was thinking about like the boogeyman or something of like cultural references, and I think one of them would be like capitalism as a reference for like, or like your parents or like whatever, you know. So
Yeah.
I don't know.
Which
I thought
isn't
of
to
that
say
and then
that
I was
those things
laughing.
aren't like necessarily accurate or true. They might be, but we're just talking about utility, right? And yeah, I think there is, because if you're working in 30 an extra 30 minutes a day, that means that I or you or we together have identified that 30 minutes of the work that you're doing every day isn't valuable or isn't valuable enough to be worth the cost that you're paying to do it, right?
Yeah, usually it's the latter. Yeah.
and and exploring why you have been doing something that we are now determining isn't valuable or isn't valuable enough to be worth the cost. Exploring why you've been doing it to me is not part of the solution. Like, if
Yeah.
we've
Yeah.
identified that this is a thing that you don't need to be doing and you could spend those resources elsewhere, then let's just focus on what else you would like to spend those resources on
Mhm.
rather than taking our resources, our time, energy, and attention, whatever, to focus on who did this to you. Like, who cares? We can,
Mhm.
not that it's never worth exploring that, but we don't need to force that into every, it's useful sometimes, not always useful.
Mhm.
I had a very small kitchen in my last apartment, and the lack of counter space itself made it much harder for me to convince myself to cook. I overheard a really interesting conversation yesterday where one person was upset that she kept hearing from people, "I used to think you were too cool to hang out with, but then I got to know your flaws and it's easier to talk to you now."
Ooh, burn.
Yeah, well, and that's funny is that obviously that's not intended to be a burn. That's people trying to like be earnest and, if anything, complimentary. Like, she understood that was meant to
Oh.
be a compliment somehow, but if they were bringing this up and calling attention to it, they could at least phrase it in a way that didn't sound like you disappointed me. Right, because what those people likely are trying to get across is you are so cool in whatever that means to me, the person who's speaking, like, right? Like, you are so
Mhm.
cool that I was afraid to approach you because I didn't think I would be cool enough for you. Like, I didn't think I deserved, I thought your time and attention was so amazing that I didn't deserve it. And now I see you as more human. I've realized that, like, even though you are very cool, you also are a human being, not some like Greek demigod or whatever. And that's
Mhm.
why it's easier now for me to hang out with you and see you as a human being. Truthfully, I would say that that actually goes most likely the opposite way. It's more that, like, as someone learns more about the fact that you are a human, they become less intimidated by you. But I can
Yeah.
see why someone would hear that and interpret that as like, oh, you have so many flaws, because we're all so insecure about ourselves. It's hard for us to hear that someone else was saying, like, no, I thought you were perfect. which is ridiculous. I was wrong. Then I realized that you're an actual real person, and I became comfortable in
Mm-hmm.
approaching you. We got this same comment phrased in the same way many times, and they never said it in an actually positive way. Well, see, that's the thing. They
Hmm.
likely did not realize that the way they're saying it could be interpreted in a positive way, because they were likely interpreting what they were saying in a positive way. They thought of it as, oh, I'm saying this nice thing. So if one person at least can interpret it in that way, it can be interpreted in that way. It can also be interpreted in a negative way, and they likely did not anticipate that the person would interpret it in a negative way, or they wouldn't have said it. Especially if this statement is true, which we're going to assume it is, right? Like, why would I assume these people are lying? If the statement is true, then what a person is saying is, I think you're amazing, so much so that like I could not even approach you until I realized that you had at least a single flaw. It's
Mm-hmm.
unlikely that a person who believes that is trying to make you feel bad about yourself.
Yeah.
Conversation was a lot about, I understand what they're trying to say, but why do they have to say it in a way that makes me anxious? So I've mentioned this before, fundamental attribution error. It's like, to me, kind of the core cognitive bias, that we have way more information about ourselves than about anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
So fundamental attribution error boils down to like, oh, everyone else is simple and I'm very complex. You know, like the reason that I do things and the reasons that things happen in my life are very complex, but the reason that other people do things and what happens in their life is very simple, because we don't have all the information necessary to know about the complexity.
Hmm.
And so we don't intellectually believe that that's true. That's why it's a cognitive bias. We
Mm-hmm.
just act as though that is true, because what else are you going to do? You have the information you have.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of those things, is those people, one of the things that must be true in order for them to phrase it in a way that your friend is receiving negatively, is that they did not consider the possibility that your friend would receive it negatively, which, given what they're saying, likely a part of that is that because they think your friend is so amazing, they don't consider that your friend might be insecure about whatever things, like all humans are.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
they fail to consider that your friend might interpret something as an insult, because why would they think that that person would be looking out for insults when they think of that person as amazing and no one would ever insult them?
Mm-hmm.
But and then your friend is making a mistake in the interpretation as well, which isn't to say that what they're doing is wrong or bad, but why they're interpreting it as though it is an insult, even though they believe it is meant to be a compliment. Your friend is interpreting it through the lens of, what are they trying to say about me, when that
Mm-hmm.
statement is actually them trying to say something about themselves.
Mm-hmm.
They're trying to explain, hey, I want you to know why I didn't approach you earlier.
Yeah. Yeah.
And quite likely, or at least possibly, come from a place of that person's fear, insecurity about like, oh, I'm so happy to be, now that I have a relationship or a friendship with this amazing person. And among all the things I'm worried about, like I used to be worried I wasn't good enough for them because they're perfect. I am now worried that they might think that I should have approached them earlier. So I better explain and justify to them why I didn't.
Mm-hmm.
Like they might be coming from a place of, I'm worried that this person might think, since I was friends, I'm worried that your friend might think that I used to think they were lame, and now I'm hanging out with them because I think they were cool. And I don't want them to think that. So I'm trying to clarify, I didn't hang out with them because I used to think they were so cool that I couldn't approach them. Now I still think they're super cool, but I'm allowed to approach them. Am I just making no sense here?
No, you're making so much sense. I was wanting to bring up politics and fundamental attribution error as it applies to like the current political climate, but I was like, I don't feel like talking about that on a stream. So that's why I was being silent. And I was happy to hear the comments. I thought that was
Yeah,
fun that we're getting these comments.
that's fine.
So that's why I
Yeah, I
was
would.
silent.
The thing about cognitive biases, like all biases, right? Like, is that people tend to think that the point of identifying them is so that you can eliminate them, which is not the case. You
Because you
can't
can't
eliminate.
eliminate fundamental attribution error,
You
correct?
can't eliminate any bias, right? Like
Yeah.
the thing that we are identifying as a bias is not an active process that a person is engaging in. We're
Hmm.
labeling a pattern that we notice where a person feels and behaves in ways that only make sense if certain pieces of data are not considered.
Hmm. Hmm.
So when we're talking about a bias, we're talking about what you are not thinking about, not what
Hmm.
you are actively thinking about. And so, in order to eliminate all biases, you would have to think about literally everything, which is impossible. So, people have this
Do you
idea that
think,
we start neutral and then we build biases actively on top of that, which are what we're actually talking about is that when you can only think about so much and do so much, there are all these things that you're going to do that are suboptimal or even like actively work against your intention and whatever because of all the stuff you didn't think about or know about.
hmm,
Right, you were asking something.
I forgot what it was. Brandon Testers.
So do you think
Oh, do you think over the time, and I know this isn't like measurable, but do you think over time the degree to which fundamental attribution error affects someone can be less if a bias can't ever like really go away?
uh it's not about affecting them less because we couldn't even measure that. But yes,
Yeah.
becoming aware of biases allows you to correct for them when you identify them. Not that you will always identify them or that you will in some way automatically and always compensate for them.
So for
Is
that
that
person, it could be like, oh, I can cognitively acknowledge that this person likely believes that they are complimenting me, and I am processing it as perhaps partially a compliment, but also, I don't know, an annoyance or bothersome or whatever, or it could have been said in a better way, and then to like kind of, I don't know, the phrase like, can I put myself in their shoes? So, I don't know. That sounds so therapy.
well, in this particular case, what it comes down to, I think, is just if you believe that what a person was trying to do was compliment you,
Hmm.
then you can intellectually at least say to yourself, that was a compliment. Even though it impacted me negatively or felt like an
Hmm.
insult, you can at least respond to the person or think of the person as a person who just complimented you, even though the way they did it actually caused you to feel some other kind of thing. Right.
Hmm.
And so a couple comments still feels like the other person could also have put more work into phrasing that better. And then how dare you sound like therapy to you, Caitlin? This is specifically not therapy. Uh,
I love that so much.
comment before, I don't know, great. But still felt like feels like the other person could also have put more work into phrasing that better. Hesitating because I don't want to come off as critical, and I know people perceive me as critical when I'm trying to, like you, Caitlin, we've had plenty of experiences where I'm like, hey, wanting to make you aware that using this language or phrasing it in that way is likely to give someone the impression that you believe or think this thing, which is different than what you actually do think or believe.
Hmm.
Because I view that as helpful, right? Like I want to give people information about how they might be
Hmm.
perceived, how they might be coming across. But it is often received as critical, as like, well, you sound like you think blah 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 blah.
Usually I feel a little bit flooded and defensive in the moment because I think as a human, it's hard to be like, oh, I really could have done that differently and in a way that is quite practical and that I actually do think could result in less blah, blah, blah. But then if I look back on it and kind of sit with it often in like by myself, then I'm like, oh, I feel calmed down enough to receive this message and it is useful. And so that in some ways is the way I'm analyzing the comments.
I think that way of receiving things, because we all do that, right? Like sometimes
Oh, yeah.
when we learn something new, that when we learn it, we think of it as, oh, this is better than what I've already thought or what I've already been doing.
Hmm.
Sometimes when we learn that, we respond to that with like excitement and joy, like, oh, this is so great that I now know how to do this better.
Hmm.
Sometimes we respond to that with that defensiveness, right? Of like,
Hmm.
well, it doesn't always have to go to defensiveness, but sometimes we respond to that by feeling badly about ourselves. Like,
Mm-hmm.
why didn't I know this already? How couldn't I have figured this out sooner? I can't believe I've been doing it wrong this whole time. Whatever.
Welcome to my 20s, Brandon.
Well, so what I'm saying is everybody does each of those things sometimes. Sometimes you're happy to learn something. Sometimes you
Yeah.
feel like an idiot for not having already learned it. Right. And I think a lot of that second thing has to do with this like myth of human perfection. The idea that
Mm-hmm.
a person, any person, theoretically could do something perfectly if they wanted it badly enough, if they put enough work into it, which is part of what I'm pointing out about that comment, right? Could have put more work. I understand the meaning of it is not this, right? That state feels like the other person could have put more work into phrasing that better. It, I believe my interpretation of that phrase is like, yeah, there are better ways they could have phrased it, right? Like had they known or had they considered or had they believed that there was reason to continue to try to phrase that, like come up with better phrasing, they could have arrived at better phrasing. I disagree with, or
Mm-hmm.
which I agree with. But some people are going to hear that. In fact, many people, including even us, will hear that and it'll reinforce this thing of like, oh, if something I did went differently than I thought or wanted, if somebody, if I insulted somebody when I was trying to compliment them, that means that I didn't work enough at it. And had I worked
Mm-hmm.
enough at it, I certainly would have been able to do it. So this myth of human perfection, this idea that if I do enough work, if I know enough things, if I care enough, whatever the particular thing, then everything will go exactly the way that I want it to.
Mm-hmm.
All of my efforts will result in exactly the outcome that I want them to have, or the belief that other people that happens for them. Where the truth is like many times, probably most of the time, you impact people in the way you're intending to with the way you phrase something. Every
Mm-hmm.
once in a while, you will fail at that and they will be impacted in some other way. When we have that experience and we're like, I could have avoided that. We're thinking that in this moment, now with retrospect, like with hindsight, I can now say, had I phrased it this way, I could have avoided that.
Mm-hmm.
But we're not thinking of it in the larger scale of like, no, I do avoid that most of the time, but every once in a
Mm-hmm.
while, something slips past me, which is the bias thing. Right? Like
Mm-hmm.
it's also part of the why I talk about cognitive miser so much. We put exactly as much resources into a thing as is warranted, as we perceive to be warranted, and that we can afford, balanced against everything else
Mm-hmm.
we're doing. But
Mm-hmm.
we think about our phrasing exactly as much as we think is necessary. But once we have phrased it in a way, which most of the time happens without any like notable conscious thought at all. Once we have phrased it in a way that we think is fine and we'll get our point across, we don't continue to think about it. It's only after it comes across different that we can then be like, oh shoot, I didn't realize, yeah, that could come across a different way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But that defensiveness comes from this, I think, this idea that people will spread that like, oh, I'm perfect, or most people are perfect. A lot of neurodiversity language to me is used by people to basically mean like some of us aren't perfect. We're not like the rest of those people that are perfect and they accomplish everything that they want to accomplish all the time. Right? They've never misunderstood and they never misunderstand other people because they know all the unwritten rules of communication. They always accomplish everything that they intend to accomplish. They always get everything on their list done and they're not late. Like a lot of this has become a way for people to kind of use language to establish this culture of like, look, some of us aren't perfect, which is the deficit model. And because we're not perfect, we need to do things in different ways than the rest of people who can just do it the way that they do it and it works perfectly for them.
Mm-hmm.
So then, yeah, of course, there's resentment, anger, self criticism, but also resentment towards others tied into when you learn something, oh, this is better. When you believe that some people already know everything and never make mistakes, it's like, damn it. It reminds me that I'm not one of those people, one of the people who
Mm-hmm.
doesn't know everything and still messes up. Because otherwise, in what logical way does it make sense to respond to learning something new that you obviously care about, or you wouldn't feel bad about having been wrong before, like improving? getting better, learning something new, your response to that is to feel bad, only makes sense
Mhm.
if you think it was possible that you could have avoided that,
Mhm.
that it was possible for you to have always known about that thing without anyone ever having to tell you. I wasn't talking about you specifically, and I'm realizing in this moment because we started out talking about you that maybe it's coming across as though I'm talking about you specifically.
Oh no, no. I was I mean, I think a lot of the streams I can find ways to apply them to myself, not in a bad way, but I was thinking about a client that this exact concept was like very much the primary dilemma last week. And then I was like, I don't know how to talk about things on the stream. Like, I was like, what language do I use? And I was like, oh, I'll ask Brandon another time.
I just think, and I'm not perfect either, right? Like I respond to things in both of those ways, but in general, I do believe that it is like somebody tells you something that you didn't know, whether that's like fact or a piece of information that is known to others, or whether that's just feedback of like, hey, you came across to me like this. That that generally I think best response to that is to be like, oh good, thank you. I didn't know that. Because at worst it's information that I didn't care about knowing. It isn't relevant to me, but it's fine to still say thank you for offering me information that turns out I don't doesn't really impact me in a way that I understand
Hmm.
important or whatever. But at best, it's like, oh, thank you. That's information I didn't have. You know, kind of like if someone's like, hey, you got something in your teeth, it could be like, oh, thank you for telling me because that's not how I want it. Or it
Hmm.
could be like, oh God, no, I can't believe it. I've been doing this all day. And then when you react like that, you're also teaching the people around you, like, don't tell me if I have something in my teeth because you'll just make me feel terrible.
Hmm.
People give you less information.
Hmm.
Anyway, the environment thing, we got to wrap up in a few minutes here, and I wanted to get back to that.
Oh,
I
okay.
am thinking this through the lens of a therapist, but the environment thing is the more influence someone has over something, anything, but in this case, we're talking about a physical environment, the more you can treat information about that thing as being indicative of what works best for that person.
Hmm.
Someone has complete and total control, which isn't real, it's hypothetical, right? Like complete and total control over a physical environment to be exactly what they want it to be without any thought or regard to any other variables. Then we can look at the environment and say, well, this is evidence then, right? Like if this is exactly how the person wants it to be, then this gives us hints and clues at what kinds of things work for that person and what kinds of
Hmm.
things tell us by their notable absence don't work for that person.
Hmm.
Does that make sense?
Oh, it just
So
cut
like
out a little
a
bit.
specific practical example of this is, oh,
Does that make
I'm
sense?
saying a
So, like a
specific, can you hear me now?
specific practical example of this? Okay.
Specific practical example of this is if I see someone whose room is covered in like soft, fuzzy, fluffy things, right? Blankets everywhere, walls covered with fabrics and hangings, and like no hard spaces observable anywhere in the room. Then I am going to think that it is likely. This is just evidence, right? Not proof. It doesn't tell me something. It just suggests possibilities to me. Then I'm going to think, ooh, it is quite likely that this person has an auditory sensitivity or an auditory processing issue, that even though they would not have ever said, I'm getting all these fluffy things because these fluffy things absorb sound and I'm covering all my hard spaces because that stops sound from being reflected back to me from different directions. The fact that the things that they like and the way they make their room end up that way suggests to me that it is quite likely that it's helpful to them to have the hard spaces covered up and to be surrounded by noise absorbing materials.
Hmm.
So I actually think when we talk about like remote work as therapists, we get a ton of information by being able to get glimpses into people's environments, not just like what's there, but also where are they when they're setting this up, and like
Mhm.
why are they meeting with me from that particular place instead of some
Mhm.
other place? And so,
Mhm.
yeah, generally, this is a general rule. If you're trying to design things to work best for you or for someone else, best place to start is to look at the things that you've already created, the things that you
Mhm.
already enjoy and things that already work for you, and say, okay, I can do some analysis to try and figure out what are the patterns and connections of why I enjoy these things or why they work for me. That's great. But I also don't even need to do that. I can just say, I know this stuff works, so let me just do more of that. Just
Mhm.
assume that it works for some reason. I like it for some reason.
Hmm.
Humans don't unlearn things. We do not subtract information and memories and experiences from ourselves. So the process of development and improvement, making things more the way we want it to be, is additive. So if we're
Mhm.
talking about whether that's decor or anything else, what I want to focus on is what do we add into your environment
Mhm.
more than what do we take away from your environment. We
Mhm.
tend to go the other way because the things that cause us problems are the things that we notice. But what happens in practice is at first it's like, well, this bothers me, that bothers me, whatever. Let's get rid of those. But once we've gotten rid of the things that you've already identified as having caused problems for you, now we're at let's add stuff that works rather than trying to go piece by piece and examine like, is this a problem for you in some way? If it's a problem,
Mhm.
you will become aware that it's a problem.
Mhm.
So we're focused on growth and addition, finding out what works for you, focusing on what helps,
Mhm.
more so than identifying and focusing on what hurts you and what causes you problem.
Hmm.
That's the side of it, or this person's very clumsy and tends to bump into everything. Soft, fuzzy things everywhere. By the way, just as a like little side note, I also think this is true of people who tend to have long hair that is worn down around their ears,
Mhm.
as well as like people who wear big shawls and scarves and high neck things of soft materials generally. I think people
Mhm.
have noted like correlation, for example, with men who tend to be creative or countercultural and men having long hair,
Mhm.
or various reasons for that. And certainly one of those things is the very recent history of our specific culture that like short hair is considered the typical masculine thing. And so long hair is a specific rejection of that. But I do actually think that there's a possibility that there are some intrinsic links between like sensitivity to sound or auditory data in a particular way and having long hair. There could also
Mhm.
be intrinsic links between being sensitive to sound and being different from others or countercultural. It's like
Mhm.
musicians having long hair. But you can also have long hair and style it in ways that are not around your ears. But anyway, what do you
I
think? I
appreciate you, Brandon.
appreciate you. That's a very cryptic statement to me in this moment. Maybe just because I'm feeling insecure right now about having like said things that I think might seem crazy or silly. But
Oh, I think they're all, I don't know, I found it fascinating and interesting and definitely not crazy and also definitely not silly. I'm just looking at the time and I was like, so that's what the I appreciate you is. This is kind of like a welcoming into the closing of the space.
I appreciate you as well. It's a great example as we're closing of that kind of thing. Your explanation makes sense of why you say that. I get it. Makes total sense. And you can also understand not that this is saying you said something wrong. You didn't.
Yeah.
An alternative explanation is like a version of somebody being like, "You're such a sweet person," and then people are receiving that as like, "Oh, you're saying I'm ugly." Right? Like by focusing on the
Hmm.
fact that you appreciate me and not responding to the thing I'm saying, it's like, yeah, I don't want to talk about it. Which I know
Oh
it's
no,
not.
I want to talk about it so badly. It's just already time.
Well, I
I would
totally
love to talk
understand.
about like cultural, counter-cultural physical markers on human beings and how that might relate to neurodiversity or different or different types of sensitivities because I actually think that happens all the time and isn't really a part of the cultural conversation often.
Yeah, Bass Insider says, I appreciate you, both of you, and I appreciate you, Bass
I
Insider.
appreciate you.
Uh,
We're
mutual
talking
appreciation
about
society.
appreciation.
Uh, I was going to say that like stereotypes and trends and things exist for reasons, and sometimes those reasons are because it serves some other person or group to artificially create and distribute stereotypes. But
Hmm.
sometimes stereotypes and trends exist because there is an observed pattern. And even in that case, it doesn't tell you what is true about someone just because of their membership in a particular group.
Hmm.
But we also don't need to shy away from the other to see that like a lot of like male rock musicians do have long hair. Like that's true. Not all and doesn't necessarily mean anything, but we don't have to pretend like we don't see the pattern either.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
what seeing these patterns is to me so fun to explore. Like theoretically, there's a reason. What are the possible reasons we could come up with? Not that any one we come up with is definitively correct or whatever, or even that we could know if it was, but it's still fun to try.
And our next stream will be a rock performance that Brandon will be.
I am a rock vocalist. It's not a coincidence.
Not a
Now, these days,
coincidence.
everybody tells me I look like Dave Grohl, which I take as a very high compliment because highly of that honor. He's the drummer for Nirvana and the lead singer of Foo Fighters.
Ooh, wow.
Uh,
Okay, I'll have to look it up.
Actually, as a little funny, like final side note, only long-haired rockers allowed. Best inside. Uh, no one could ever know this. It isn't me, but sometimes when people tell me I look like Dave Grohl, even though I take it as a compliment, I know they're complimenting me, saying something they think is cool. It also makes me calls attention to my own like physical condition because there was a time in the past where I was working out more and more muscular and bigger, and at that point in time, everyone was telling me that I looked like Jason Momoa. So this is a
Oh.
this is a
Hmm.
just an example of how like things that like a person saying I look like Dave Grohl could not possibly be aware of the fact that I am comparing that to a time where I was told I looked like someone else and then somehow connecting it to a criticism of myself that I already had.
Hmm. Welcome to my world.
Everything
I'm
is
hoping to
infinitely
stop it.
complex.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Good to be with you, Caitlin. I appreciate you. And
Thanks, everyone.
bye. End
Bye.
stream.